Well, tonight I'm going to confess to a real rookie mistake. I bit off more than I could chew. The more I looked into the woman I'd chosen to speak about, the more interesting I found them, and I soon discovered that they all deserve a presentation each. In fact, two of them I have actually presented on before, but one of them, it was so long ago that it's on the talk's on CD-ROM, so I wasn't able to retrieve it. So what I'm presenting tonight is only a thumbnail view of each of them and the result of this, my studies up until now. As is usual with Theosophical studies, I'll repeat what Simon's just said. The Theosophical Society does not have any dogmas or doctrines or infallible authorities, and I'm certainly not one of those anyway. Theosophy is an ancient view of life that has been expressed in different formats and changing language throughout the ages. Also, I expanded my view from their contribution to what they did in the Theosophical Society into what they did in general society. Then I discovered angles and activities that I'd never dreamed of, which produced some interesting rabbit holes to fall down. For example, I knew Geraldine Hemus through her theosophical and family activities, and as my grandmother's legal guardian after my grandmother was orphaned as a teenager, so I'd heard plenty about Geraldine Hemus, and I visited her home several times, and then I visited it much more recently under a new owner. But I never knew she was active politically as well as theosophically through the National Council of Women. And I've yet to discover how much she was involved with the Auckland Unitarian Church. When I look at the people of the past, my main interest is not so much what they did as why they did it. My question as a 4-year-old to my grandmother used to be along the lines of who came to New Zealand and why did they come? Turned out that most of them were starry-eyed idealists who thought they were coming to utopia. Then they got off the boat in Auckland and were met by an open sewer running down the middle of Queen Street, at which point the settlers mostly abandoned their settlement and took off in the opposite direction. Is there anything we can learn from these people of the past that we can apply to today's world and how we approach our own 21st century lives? And I actually haven't covered that in as much detail as I had hoped I would. Didn't press it hard enough by the looks of things. You did say the down arrow? Yeah, right, that's what I wanted. Now, I have a request to talk about Countess Constance Buckmeister, who was not one of my original subjects, and that is because under Peter Lineham at Massey University, my honours dissertation was on Constance Buckmeister and her tour of New Zealand. I am not going to attempt to pronounce her birth name, but she was actually a countess in her own right, not through either inheritance or from a father or the man she married. So she was born in Florence in Italy in 1838, but her parents died shortly after she was born, so she was sent to be raised by an aunt in England, where she went to the local schools in London. Now, also in London in 1863, she married a cousin, Swedish Count Karl Wachtmeister, who was the Swedish and Norwegian minister at the court of St. James at the time. Now, the person who marked this blasted me for not saying he was the ambassador, but not one single authority I read called him the ambassador, so that's why it wasn't in there. And they had one son, Axel, who became a prominent musician and wrote an opera that was popular at the time. Now, during her Australian tour, which was just before she came to New Zealand, the Countess said her interest in spirituality started when she became a medium during a séance in London during 1878. Later, she also studied mesmerism. She was unable to accept the spiritualistic explanations of the facts she had observed and experienced. So she continued her study, and that led her to meet Helena Blavatsky in London. And then she described herself as being a cosseted child of the upper classes and had not known any hardship. And so 2 years later, while packing up her belongings to spend the winter in Italy, she was prompted to include a manuscript on tarot in her luggage. On her way south, she heard that Madame Blavatsky was in a spa in Germany and was unwell. So she offered to stay with her for a month on her way to Italy. HPB refused. Then, shortly afterwards, the Countess got a telegram saying, "Come at once." HPB, which is how we normally refer to Madame Blavatsky, explained that she only had one bedroom to share, and she felt would not be up to the standard that the Countess was used to. Then she demanded the manuscript and quoted from it, saying, "The master wants it for this book I'm writing, The Secret Doctrine." So Countess stayed for a month, but that month got to be very long. She was working then for Madame Blavatsky until the end of almost the end of her life. So it settled into a routine of Blavatsky spending long hours writing her book, while the Countess managed the household, nursed HPB when she was sick, made fair copies of the manuscript, and dealt with some of the correspondence. But she said later in her book, she did not understand the work that Blavatsky was engaged in. She wrote in reminiscences of H.P. Blavatsky and The Secret Doctrine. At that time, it is true, I understood very little of what I copied and did not realize the value of the teachings as I do now. It is my one continued regret that I lost so much of that precious time by not comprehending either her position or my own. When I first went to her, I was a woman of the world, one who had been a petted child of fortune. Through my husband's political position, I had a prominent place in society. It therefore took me a long time to realize the hollowness of what I had hitherto looked upon as being the most desirable objects in life. It required much training and many a hard battle with myself before I could conquer the satisfaction in self, which a life of idleness, ease, and high position is sure to engender. So much had to be knocked out of me, to use one of HPB's own phrases, and it is with a feeling of intense gratitude that I look back on the past and think of all that she did for me and how she rendered me a slightly better instrument to work in the Theosophical Society, which is both my duty and my pleasure to perform. Madame Blavatsky was an expert at knocking corners off people. And so when they moved from Germany to England, which is where much of the work of the writing the secret doctrine was done, and the Countess, the Keatley brothers, and others really formed a team. When Blavatsky had finished writing it, she is said to have had a heap of manuscript about yay high, which she was then said to them, oh, do what you like with it. And because Isis Unveiled had raised a storm of how Blavatsky had supposedly plagiarized it from books that she couldn't possibly have got from the bowels of university libraries, this team checked all the references in it. And at that time, Countess Wachtmeister removed herself from the daily work with Madame Blavatsky and went into the publishing business. She funded it largely herself, the founding of what's called the Theosophical Publishing House. Had several names before that. Now, if I click that, will it? Yes. So in 1895 and 1896, during a period of turmoil in the Theosophical Society following HPB's death, Countess Wachtmeister visited first the United States with Annie Besant, and then Australia and New Zealand on an extended self-funded lecture tour. Now, the Theosophical Society, like many other spiritual societies, had a crisis of continuance after HPB's death, and eventually was settled on Annie Besant as her successor, but the what is called the American section of the Theosophical Society broke away. So then we had two Theosophical Societies. Now, I must say, when I was doing my research for this, it was the American section that was most helpful in finding materials for me, because they actually had an archivist. So a common thread throughout the frequent and comprehensive newspaper reports of her tour was bewilderment at the complexity of the ideas presented. Theosophy was never going to be a mass movement. It appealed mostly to an educated, thoughtful elite, or to people who wanted a more intellectual answer to observed non-physical phenomena than was available in the parallel movements. And at that time, there were quite a few parallel movements, and sometimes they clashed with each other. So at the time that the Countess visited New Zealand, public religious debate was an acceptable form of entertainment, and lectures, sermons, or debates could sometimes have very large audiences. I believe the Countess's audience here in Wellington was somewhere along the lines of 700 people. A heated response then could be relied upon from the local Christian community. The resulting fracas would be gleefully seized on as copy by the local press and often reported throughout the country. Then the press would rehash all the concocted and often fraudulent attacks on HBB and her Mahatmas, who couldn't possibly exist in the eyes of colonial powers and Christian missionaries, because everyone knows that miracles and phenomena don't exist, and the supposedly primitive religions of the East were where people worshipped idols made of butter and very inferior. So I, even in my time at university, a friend of mine and I, we were making up our papers and we decided to do anthropology, the two of us. And we walked in from the religious studies department, Waikato University. We went over the hill to a lecture, the first lecture on anthropology. We had looked at religions as founder religions, where your founder was known, like Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad, and developing religions like Taoism, which we didn't actually say very much about, and Hinduism, and so on. And we got told very sternly as we walked in that no, it was primitive religions. Well, I don't see anything primitive about Hinduism. The pair of us, myself, the heretic, and my friend, the wicked, turned around and walked out of class. So that was the end of me in anthropology, at least at that stage. So another thing I got slated for was not saying anything about the division of the ADYA, an American section, Theosophical Society, because the lecturer who marked it had an idea in their heads that that was why she was here. Now, actually, when I first started, I thought, because it was only a couple of years after the split, that that might have been the case, but I found absolutely no evidence in any of my source material that it might have been. The actual object of her visit was because it was when the individual sections, which are autonomous, were established, New Zealand was part of the Australasian section. So we were bumped in with Australia. But then in the days of going across the Tasman Sea by steamer, it was proving to be too much, too far apart, so that the New Zealand section decided they wanted to be a section, but for that purpose, they needed 7 lodges and they only had 6. So the tour was tours both by Lillian Edgar, whom I will talk about next, and by Countess Wachtmeister, were with the aim of establishing a 7th lodge of the Theosophical Society. As a result of her visit, because of the entertainment value of all this debate, very few people actually joined the society. The Whanganui Lodge was started afterwards as a result of her visit, but an Auckland member had gone across the harbour and started a new lodge, which was called the Waitemata Lodge, and history would be very interesting. What's that?
How large is the first 1888?
We were the first in 1888. It was fizzled out and was rechartered, and I'm not quite sure of the date that it was rechartered. But Auckland, which was the second, I think, much the same thing happened to it. So we got our 7 lodges, and while the Countess was still here, got a telegram establishing New Zealand as a New Zealand section in 1866. So now the rest of the people I want to talk about are New Zealanders. Lillian Edgar was, for the first 6 years of her life, She grew up in Albertland, one of the last, was the last of the so-called Wakefield settlements. It was a settlement of so-called nonconformists. That means not Roman Catholic and not Anglican, everybody else. It did eventually split back into its component parts. Now, Lillian's father was the pastor to that congregation, and it was his ideal to establish an unsectarian form of Christianity. As I said, it didn't actually happen in Albertland. It split up into its component parts. And he would have educated Lillian at home as he had educated her next oldest sister, Kate Edgar. However, as happens so often, I mean, as I said, they got off the boat and were faced with this open sewer drain that was Queen Street. Then they went, the ship took them up to Riverhead, where they were dropped off a mile shy of the landing. Now, they actually took the whole of the settlers because the transport they'd paid for to get to Port Albert never arrived. It was paid for by Reverend Edgar. It took them longer to get from Riverhead to Port Albert, which is near Welsford, than it took them to get from England to New Zealand, despite the fact that the ship they were in was dismasted, lost 2 of its 3 masts off South Africa. And most of the journey was done by jury rig. And then the second ship that left at the same time arrived 3 weeks later. But the problem was the Matilda Wittenbach was a cutter ship with raked masts, and it got dismasted several times and eventually disappeared in the China Sea. Whereas the Hanover, the ship that left at the same time, was a little round tub, and it got here, but a little bit longer. Okay, that's got nothing to do with the subject. So when the family were at church, the house burned down. It was a very, very common problem in early settler life in New Zealand because everything was dependent on fire, your lighting, your cooking. And often, if you go to old houses, you'll find the kitchen is outside or the copper in the wash house is outside. And that's one of the reasons why. So the house burned down, and they were sitting down to lunch because Reverend Edgar did 2 services and they had lunch in town. And then Lillian's older brother came in, Papa, the house has burned down. And the answer was, I dare say it has. And so it happened so often in the settler times. So they all rushed out, the whole entire congregation rushed out, and all they could find was a teaspoon, which means that Samuel lost all his books and all the musical instruments. And so they moved to Auckland. And there, Lillian and her older sister went to what is now Epsom Boys, Auckland Grammar. And the stories say that the night school, all the apprentices and young men, and these 2 young ladies, would be walking up Queen Street to go to the night school to further their education or their apprenticeships. So she got her BA there. At the time, The University of New Zealand was actually only an examining board, which meant that they controlled the exams, but there were separate campuses established at Christchurch and Otago, but Auckland, and I don't know about Victoria, was at best a leaky old army hut, which with a floor described as a leaky old army hut with a floor that wasn't safe to walk on by Lillian's older sister. Doubt that would have bothered either of them, because Kate was about 4'10" tall, and Lillian, I don't think, was very much taller. In 1882, she completed a master's degree and graduated with her older sister, and also cleaned up the boys in maths and science. Girls weren't taught the classics, which was what was proper university. In fact, they were lucky to get that, but there was the person in charge of Christchurch campus at the time was very keen on having girls to come and study. And there is debate about whether they were the first and second or the second and third woman MAs, because if you read from Christchurch, they'll say Helen Connon was the first. And if you read from Auckland, they'll say Kate Edgar was the first. And the reason for that I've found is that in looking in papers past, I cannot find any notification of Helen Connon's graduation, but it would appear to have been the year before, 1881, because at the beginning of 1882, there is an advertisement for Christchurch Girls High, which states Helen Connon, MA, Lillian, and Kate and Lillian Edgar, BA at that point. So there's debate, and you'll find it further on when I get to Jenna Hemus, there's a similar debate going on. So then they were teaching while they were doing their final year of their MA, and then they took up positions as the headmistress, founding principal and deputy principal at Nelson Girls High School. Now, Lily wasn't there very often, very long. She went back to Auckland and established a place called Ponsonby College. In the family owned a huge house which contained, among living quarters, but also the Theosophical headquarters, and the upper floor was converted by Lillian to being to being Ponsonby College, it was called. And so it was a private school. But in 1896, Lillian gave up her school and worked full-time for the Theosophical Society for the rest of her life. She did these tours, speaking tours, and then when she was in Sydney, when the section was declared, with Colonel Olcott, and he persuaded her to go to India to talk at the National Convention there, and she didn't come back until, apart from visits to the family and lecture tours, until 1939. So they would say, described her speaking as vibrant and simple, lacked the heavy reliance on Sanskrit terminology that was being used in Theosophical writings at the time, sometime. And this is a copy of her book, The Elements of Theosophy, which when I first joined was always given to new Theosophists as a basic as an understanding of the teachings of Theosophy. This is actually an Amazon edition. It is still available, but this one cost me $115, and that's before the book depository was cancelled by Amazon. And Gloria gave me a copy, and then I promptly ordered a second copy. So this is what I noticed with reading through it as much older than when I first read it. Beautiful, clear, simple English, and she likes to refer it back to the science of the day, which of course now has dated it rather. So I think a revision of this would be very helpful myself. Don't have time to do it myself. Now I run out of notes. Okay. So I've done these people, I've rearranged the time frames, the order, because I've done them in the order, time order that they were born. So the next one is a very interesting lady. Now, she also comes from a family of academics, but she wasn't academic herself. Her older sister dismisses her rather as being a lazy scholar, but that didn't stop her from changing Christchurch. So her name was Elizabeth Reed McCombs, and was born in November 1873, and eventually became our first woman member of Parliament. Now, it is interesting that James McCombs is reported as having been, that was her husband, one of the early Theosophists. Now, nowhere in any of the literature I've read about her does it mention her Theosophy. She was one of 9 children, and many of them were activists. 2 of her sisters were in the public eye, Stella writing for a public New Zealand newspaper, and Christina active in the suffrage movement. It sounds really as if they were all in the suffrage movement. And I'll say that Lillian, her sister Marion, and her sister Eva, both all signed the petition, the suffrage petition. But what I don't know is why Kate was in Auckland to sign it in Auckland, because in fact she lived in Wellington. So McCombs was very interested in socialism through the influence of her elder sisters. And they were part of that was the rights of women. So in 1903, she marries James McCombs, and as I've said, he was a Theosophist, he was a socialist, and they had 2 children and adopted 2 more. So he stood for Parliament for the very fledgling Labour Party, and became the party's first president, I would imagine, in Christchurch. And at the same time, Elizabeth was elected to the party executive alongside another woman. However, her interest was mostly in local body politics, and again, she noted that at one stage that women were coming into town to do their shopping, with their children. So I can tell you, as having been a solo mother, if you don't take the kids, you don't go yourself. Or the men were working and the same thing applied. So she was instrumental in establishing the plunket rooms and a creche where the children could be left. And I can remember even in the 70s when I lived briefly in Wellington with a young son, and we'd come down from Wadestown in the bus, and I'd do my shopping. There was a creche in the building that had the Matterhorn in it. So we would go, I would leave him in the creche, do my shopping, and then we'd both go to the Matterhorn, which this was before it was a bar, it was a coffee bar type place, and it had a courtyard. So that it was a handy place to be and feed a kid. And then we'd catch the bus back up to Wadestown, whereupon Manu would promptly throw a tantrum, being rather tired after all the excitement. So anyway, creches was one of the things she did. And meanwhile, and she did hospital board, and she did something to do with the electricity department as well. Meanwhile, her husband was a long-term Labor member for Littleton, and he died. And he'd only had a very, very tiny majority in his seat. And so there was some discussion. Elizabeth had tried twice in different elections around Christchurch to stand for Parliament and not got in. But this time, there was some discussion, it was such a small minority, we can't take the danger of putting a woman in that seat. She won by a massive landslide, and made her maiden speech in Parliament on the 28th of September. With a response that looked rather like that. That's one of the local newspapers, got the parliamentarians all in drag, very old-fashioned looking, dowdy looking drag to me. And whereas Elizabeth is looking modern and brisk and ready to stir them all up. The other cartoon I had that was in good enough shape to project has her, it's a jack-in-the-box, and it has Elizabeth leaning out of the jack-in-the-box at the parliamentarians in front of her, and behind her is a huge Maori carving of the actual jack-in-the-box. So, James had been returned by only 32 votes in the 1931 elections. Elizabeth got a majority of 2,600 votes. And then she spoke out in Parliament on a number of issues, many of which involved women's rights and welfare. Among the causes she promoted were changes to unemployment policy, which was more generous towards unemployed men than unemployed women. They'd have been lucky they were even acknowledged as unemployed. Recruitment of women into the police force, raising the age of marriage, which at that time was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. And in poor health, she'd been an asthmatic all her life, made it difficult for her to participate fully in politics. And she died in Christchurch in 1935, aged 61, less than 2 years after entering Parliament. So I didn't mention that she had been actually elected to the Christchurch City Council. Now, interestingly enough, Geraldine was one of the hardest ones to do, despite the fact that I had actually known her. And I haven't written my notes for her either. That's odd, I did have notes. So Geraldine Hemus was actually Lillian Edgar's niece. Her mother was Lillian Edgar's first older sister. She was educated at Lillian School at Ponsonby College, which also at that time was the Hemus family home. And in 1907, she was admitted to the bar. She had, her and a friend, Ellen Melville, must have discussed this previously because Ellen and, because they went to university together and did law. And so that she had done the law. She'd been an articled clerk, whatever that was. It looks like from looking at how she became a lawyer, you sort of started at the bottom and worked up, and then you had to be sponsored by your employer. And it was her employer who had sponsored her to become a lawyer. She became a sole practitioner eventually, mostly doing women's issues and property, I think. Oh, just as he is. So she also, this was a new one on me. She studied shorthand with the Auckland Shorthand Writers Association and then went on to study law at Auckland University College, and she became an articled clerk in 1898. She became the treasurer of the Auckland branch of the National Council of Women for most of the 1930s and held the position of branch president of that organisation from 1938 to 1941. In her role as president, she sent a letter to the Justice Minister, H.G.R. Mason, recommending the appointment of women associates in magistrates' courts for domestic proceedings. Now, you remember Elizabeth McCombs was on the same subject. Now, H.G.R. Mason was another theosophist. Both of them were strict vegetarians. And I can recall in the 70s coming down to this lodge on special occasions where I think HGR must have been in his 90s or something, because he would sort of sit where Simon is with a rug over his knees, and they always made sure that my landlord, Reginald Mathers, was not around when HGR Mason was, and vice versa, because they were notorious for having very long arguments. So that's She also served, back to Geraldine, or Jenna as I knew her, served as treasurer for the New Zealand executive of the Theosophical Society. She often spoke in public lectures, subjects, the power of thought, justice or mercy, which, the change that we call death, prohibition, some points of view. And she was also instrumental in establishing the Vasanta Garden School, which opened in Epsom in 1919 and was based on basically theosophical ideas of education. And she was, well, according to Wikipedia, president of the trust board during the 1930s, but in actual fact, she was on that trust board until the school closed down in 1959. This thing I found on her was the Law Society's obituary. It's a great thing when you're trying to research somebody to get hold of their obituary. But they always say nice things about you too, the obituary. And I think that the Wikipedia article I just read was mostly taken from this. And as I mentioned, she had a lifelong friendship with Ellen Melville. And in 1934, Geraldine and a deputation of women citizens visited Ellen Melville, who was the second woman to be admitted as a lawyer in New Zealand. There's less argument about whether she was the second than there is about whether Geraldine was the third, because there's somebody in between there that nobody can find records of. And they wanted Ellen Melville to accept nomination as a candidate for the mayoralty of Auckland. Well, Ellen Melville didn't win, but she was elected to the city council. And after Ellen's death, it was Geraldine Hemus that was mostly responsible for the building of the Ellen Melville Hall, which is just off Queen Street, Albert. I can't remember the name of the street it's actually on, but it's going up towards the university. What's that? It's up the top of it, I think, and then there's a road that goes up.
Yeah.
And then just past there was where Geraldine's office was pointed out to me by my grandmother, in a building that at that stage had been converted to a car park, but it was before you got up to the High Court. So she was also branch president, and her and she was active in the Unitarian Church. But although I have a couple of histories of the Unitarian Church, because the gentleman who wrote them was one of my classmates at Massey University, I can't find out how much she was involved in that. So interesting that what she said when she retired as branch president. By then it was HPB Lodge. And it gives a good idea of what she was thinking. We lament the lack of women in Parliament, she said, but I feel it is no use to having them there unless they're fully qualified. For the work of government, they need long and specific training. They should have a strong sense of truth and justice, the womanly quality of sympathetic understanding, and an ardent desire for the welfare of humanity. They must also have trained minds, a broad outlook, and the ability to sustain an argument, to marshal their facts and put their case clearly. Especially do they need a working knowledge of the science of government and of the science of living. When we have more of such women, then we shall have a happier world. I look to the younger university women, particularly to qualify themselves for high positions. as their children grow up, let us hope that they will be ready to take an important part in helping bring about peacefully the great social changes which must inevitably come after the war. When women are thus qualified, I feel sure their sex will not be a bar to their attainment. I have heard a lawyer say recently that there's still a bit of this sort of stuff going on. She said to me, "Why do you think I always wear trousers?" So they were, Geraldine would have been brought up a Theosophist. She was associated with the Santa Garden School. And she was also associated with the establishment of 371 Queen Street as at that stage, the same thing again, at that stage was both the national headquarters and both the national headquarters and the HPB Lodge has a hall that seats 200. It also was an architectural first in New Zealand in having the largest suspended concrete floor in New Zealand. And a guy that was the caretaker of it at one stage said that the huge Moreton Bay fig that's right next door in Myers Park has roots that go right under it and come up on the other side. That building was sold, became a nightclub and a brothel.
I joined in that building. And I was
Yeah.
working by after the
Yeah,
top story floor.
yeah, yeah. I used to go there when I lived in Auckland, and I'd go there with Manu, my oldest son. I must have had the two younger ones babysat. And I can recall walking up the steep hill towards there, and this portly gentleman in a black suit marched purposefully past us and up the steps to where the books and the office were, because they had a Friday lunch table. And that's where we were heading. Well, that's all very well, but we only get a few more paces up the hill.
Can I just make a comment here?
Yeah.
After the building became a nightclub and a brothel, I popped in one day just out of curiosity to see what had happened there. I mean, it was a beautiful building. We absolutely loved it. And interestingly, on the ground, not the ground floor, the middle floor that you walked onto from the street, that was the main body of the nightclub there. But they still had up high, right round the room, the words, "There is no religion higher than truth." They had never removed that. I thought it was quite interesting. Anyway, that's just an aside.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. Okay, so Manu watched this gentleman walk up and up the steps. Then a few paces further on, the same portly black clad suited gentleman walks briskly past us and up the steps. And Manu sort of looked at him, right round the back, looked up at the steps, right round the back. There's two of him. It was, in fact, Graham Eden's father and his uncle, who were identical twins. And that's, yeah, so that's And I think I have run out of time. Yes, I have actually. And the last lady is among the most interesting, but I was not able to find a photograph of her. Now, Lara May is online. She has done a whole website of the Vasanta Garden School, and I will describe this, the sort of scene you would see when you went to it. If you came in the Walborough Avenue entrance, which would be behind the open air classroom there, you would see this beautiful garden, and you might see rows of desks of children sitting at desks doing their schoolwork outside. You might see them playing games as they are here. You might see them dancing or doing eurythmics, which is something that came through with the Steiner schools. It's a patterned form of dance exercise. So the headmistress of that was Bertha Darragh. And she had an attitude to education that was quite different from what we hear now. In one of her talks, she said, the new education represented a new attitude towards the child, who was no longer to be regarded simply as clay in the potter's hands, but as an individual being who was here to work out its own destiny and must not be coerced or forced in any direction. Miss Darragh deprecated the present system of education, which was, she said, a cold and mechanical institution at best, and incapable of appreciating the vastly different temperaments and abilities of those it controlled. Well, I can imagine if she heard what the current government wants to do to education, she'd be standing up there in the back of the hall, banging her walking stick on the ground and telling us exactly what she thought of it, which is what she used to do whenever we had a youth panel at convention. So she took over the school, which is that building in the background is the current headquarters. This school reached right down past the houses that are along Margot Street. They were built after the school closed, and they were built on a system of lease for life, and have now reverted back to Theosophical Society ownership. Now, Bertha started in 1922. She had 13 boys and girls of varying ages from 5 to 11 years. And the teaching staff at the time she was writing, which was, this is the Jubilee account, never got much over 60 for lack of space, even though they did build more classrooms, including that one. And there was actually a fashion for open air classrooms in the 1930s. And the school I went to, it was a primary school in the 1950s, all the classrooms had huge bifold doors that slid open in the hot summer, and big verandas. And as it was a Maori school I went to, in the wet weather, you would see the boys playing the heitama tutama, which is a kind of rock, scissors, paper type game, very fast. The girls playing jackstones, which is a very complicated version of knucklebones, and me just watching because I couldn't catch the stones. So, yeah, so open air classrooms were nearly every school had one, but our school, entire school seemed to be built of them. And I think some of them are still there. So Daphne was, her younger sister was in charge of the infant department, and both lived up the hill. I went into Bertha's house once. It was derelict at that stage, and There was only two rooms and a kitchen and a lean-to that must have been the wash house, perhaps bathroom. And unfortunately, it was in a state of dereliction at that time. I was able to walk straight through. And a beautiful one is right on the top of Mount St. John, beautiful windows all along the front that look straight out over the over towards Mount Eden. And my curiosity had been aroused, because whenever I went to headquarters, I would get off the bus, I would come up Wilbur Avenue, and there would be all of these windows up the top reflecting the sun. So she says here, she was taking a model from overseas called the Dalton Plan, but as she started, she had the idea that the New Zealand type of child and the environment under which she was to work, the plan needed modifying. Each child from 9 years to 12 years was provided with a quarterly work chart, which consists of assignments of work in various subjects. And with that method, he proceeded at his own work in his own way, and with no sense of competition creeping into mar spontaneous individual endeavour. As you go on, you'll find that that was a bit idealistic, because that's exactly what happened. Of course, there are no punishments or impositions of any kind, nor is there any compulsory homework, but the average child sees to it that he's not behind those with whom he considers he should be equal. I often hear the children discussing amongst themselves what homework they will do to hasten their work, while little groups will arrange to do the same homework on particular evenings, and others will plan to arrive an hour earlier in the morning or stay an hour later. It does sound as if she did a lot of group work. She found that the only drawback with her plan was that the over-conscientious child worries if they can't cope with the assignment up to date. And so she would give extra tuition if that was necessary. She said, so sensitive are such types that are not wholly satisfied with this arrangement, which seems a little unfair to their mates. Children have an acute sense of justice. Otherwise, plan works admirably and develops initiative, a sense of personal responsibility and independence. So, independent learning, and I would imagine that also you would be able to go into interest subjects, which isn't possible when you have a one-size-fits-all plan. So that, and you find particularly with neurodiverse children that often they will pick up something and want to run with it, and then you build your maths and your science and your language skills around whatever the interest is. And so you might have a group over here studying, well, for argument's sake, sailing ships. But how much maths is there in designing, building and sailing a sailing ship? And over here, somebody might be looking at something completely different. So and eventually, Bertha retired because of ill health, and this school was so unique that they were unable to replace her and finished up having to close it down. Now, interestingly enough, when I went to Teachers College and they wanted to kick me out, they told me I had failed, but obviously I hadn't, because if I'd failed, I wouldn't have been due for my bond. So they sent me to Dr. Bennett, the local psychiatrist, to say, and eventually I think what he said was I was immature. But I walk in there, and first thing I met was something of a state of shock, because the guy sitting behind the desk was a Maori. And so we sat down, talked, asked me if I had a boyfriend, among other things. how well I was doing and what did I really want to keep on teaching. And I said, I'd rather do kindergarten, which is what I wanted to do in the first place. And then he said he sent his children to the Vasanta school. So by then it wasn't confined to Theosophists. And then after her retirement from that, she must have gotten better from her ill health because she became General Secretary of the New Zealand section, which is what we called the
President.
previously called what's now the President of New Zealand. The reason for that being in the early days that there was one president and it was the one in Adyar, so that the leaders of the different national sections were called General Secretary. And that is about all I have